The humid air of Papua New Guinea clung to everything like a wet blanket in the summer of 1943. At the makeshift airfield carved out of the jungle near Port Moresby, a single aircraft sat apart from the sleek P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts that lined the runway. It was a Douglas A-24 Banshee, a dive bomber that most pilots dismissed as outdated, slow, and better suited for crop dusting than aerial combat. The other pilots had given it that exact nickname, the Crop Duster, and they never let its pilot forget it. If you're enjoying this story of determination against all odds, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more incredible true stories from history. Captain Thomas Mitchell stood beside his aircraft, running his hand along the fuselage with the care of someone tending to an old friend. At 32, he was older than most of the hotshot fighter pilots on the base, and his background made him an outlier in every sense. Before the war, Tom had been a flight instructor in rural Montana, teaching farmers and ranchers how to fly small planes over their vast properties. He had logged thousands of hours in the air, but none of it was in the kind of high-performance fighters that dominated the skies over the Pacific. When he had volunteered after Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Forces had looked at his age and experience and assigned him to dive bombers. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't what the newspapers wrote about, but Tom had accepted it without complaint. He understood that every role mattered in this war, even if it didn't come with glory. The problem was that his fellow pilots didn't see it that way. Lieutenant Jake Brennan, a 23-year-old from Boston who flew a P-38 with cocky precision, was the worst of them. He had made it his personal mission to remind Tom daily that he was flying what Brennan called a death trap with wings. That morning, as Tom performed his pre-flight checks, Brennan and two other fighter pilots approached, their boots crunching on the crushed coral that served as the airfield's surface. The sun was already brutal, and sweat stained their flight suits despite the early hour. "Hey, Mitchell," Brennan called out, his voice carrying that particular brand of confident mockery that young men excel at. "You planning to fertilize some rice paddies today? Maybe spray for mosquitoes?" The other pilots laughed, and Tom paused his inspection, straightening up to face them. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had the calm steadiness of someone who had seen enough of life to not be easily rattled. "Just doing my job, Lieutenant," Tom replied evenly. "Same as you." Brennan stepped closer, close enough that Tom could smell the coffee on his breath. The younger pilot gestured at the A-24 with exaggerated concern. "Your job is to fly that thing? Mitchell, I've seen faster clouds. If you run into zeros, you might as well just bail out and save everyone the trouble of a funeral." The other pilots shifted uncomfortably. The ribbing had started as harmless banter weeks ago, but Brennan had been pushing it further lately, and the edge in his voice had grown sharper. Tom suspected it had less to do with him personally and more to do with the pressure they were all under. The Japanese had been relentless in this theater, and casualties among pilots had been mounting. "I'll manage," Tom said quietly, turning back to his aircraft. "You'll manage to get yourself killed," Brennan shot back, "and maybe take a few of us with you when we have to cover your slow rear end." Tom didn't respond. He had learned long ago that some arguments weren't worth having, especially when fear and stress were doing most of the talking. He finished his checks in silence, while the fighter pilots eventually wandered away, still chuckling among themselves. Sergeant Eddie Nakamura, Tom's crew chief, emerged from beneath the aircraft where he had been inspecting the landing gear. Eddie was a second-generation Japanese-American from California, and his presence on the base was a testament to both his skill and the complex realities of the war. Many of his relatives were in internment camps back home, but Eddie had volunteered anyway, determined to prove his loyalty and fight for his country. "Don't let them get to you, Captain," Eddie said softly, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "They don't know what they're talking about." Tom offered a small smile. "I know, Eddie, but they're scared. We all are." Eddie nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. The A-24 might not have been fast, but Eddie maintained it with meticulous care, and Tom trusted him completely. That trust mattered more than all the fancy equipment in the world. "She's ready to fly," Eddie confirmed, engines purring like a kitten. Well, a slow kitten. Tom laughed despite himself. "Thanks, Eddie. I'll bring her back in one piece." "You better," Eddie replied with mock severity. "I just spent 6 hours on that port engine." The mission briefing that morning had been straightforward. A convoy of Japanese transport ships had been spotted heading toward Leh, and the bombers were being sent to disrupt them. The fighter escorts would provide cover, engaging any enemy aircraft that appeared while the bombers made their runs. Tom climbed into his cockpit, the familiar routine calming his nerves. He strapped himself in, checked his instruments, and started the engine. The propeller coughed to life, and the whole aircraft vibrated with mechanical enthusiasm. It wasn't elegant, but it was reliable, and in combat, reliability often mattered more than speed. As the formation took off, Tom found his place in the bomber group, flying low and slow compared to the fighters that circled above like protective hawks. The flight to the target area took nearly an hour, and Tom used the time to scan the sky constantly, his eyes searching for the telltale glint of sunlight on metal that would signal enemy aircraft. The ocean below was a stunning blue, almost peaceful in its vastness. It was hard to reconcile such beauty with the violence that had consumed this part of the world. Tom thought briefly of his wife, Sarah, back in Montana. She wrote him letters every week, filling page after page with news from home, reminding him of what he was fighting for. Her last letter had mentioned that their neighbor's son had been killed at Guadalcanal, and the grief in her words had cut deeper than any physical wound Tom had ever experienced. The radio crackled to life, yanking him back to the present. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, Zeros inbound. Tom's heart rate kicked up, but his hands remained steady on the controls. He could see them now, a formation of Japanese fighters diving toward the bombers like falcons after prey. The Allied fighters scrambled to intercept, and the sky erupted into chaos. The first Zero came at Tom head-on, tracers from its machine guns stitching a line through the air. Tom jinked left, feeling the sluggish response of the A-24, and returned fire with his forward guns. He didn't expect to hit anything, the angle was wrong, but he needed the Zero pilot to know he wasn't helpless. The Japanese fighter flashed past him, and Tom immediately threw the bomber into a steep dive, using gravity to build speed. The A-24 might have been slow in level flight, but it could dive like a brick, and Tom had spent years mastering the nuances of dive bombing. He knew every vibration, every sound, every quirk of the aircraft. Another Zero appeared on his tail, and Tom could hear the chatter of its guns over the roar of his engine. Bullets punched through his left wing, and alarms blared in the cockpit. Tom gritted his teeth and pulled into a tight turn, tighter than the manual said the A-24 could handle. The G-forces pressed him into his seat, and his vision started to grey at the edges, but he held the turn, bleeding speed but forcing the Zero to overshoot. As the Japanese fighter passed him, Tom lined up a snapshot and squeezed the trigger. His guns barked, and he saw impact sparkle along the Zero's fuselage. Smoke poured from the enemy aircraft, and it rolled away, trailing fire. Tom didn't have time to celebrate. Another Zero was diving toward him, and he pushed the nose down again, heading for the deck. The ocean rushed up to meet him, and he leveled out barely 50 feet above the waves, the spray from his prop wash visible in his peripheral vision. The Zero followed, and Tom led it on a wild chase across the water. He zigged and zagged, using every trick he had learned in years of flying, making the A-24 dance despite its limitations. The Japanese pilot was skilled, staying with him through every maneuver. But Tom was patient. He waited for his moment, and when the Zero pulled up slightly to avoid a wave, Tom hauled back on the stick and climbed. The Zero matched him, but Tom had anticipated that. At the top of his climb, he snap-rolled inverted and pulled through, coming down behind the Japanese fighter in a maneuver that defied every expectation of what a dive bomber could do. He fired, and this time his aim was perfect. The Zero's canopy shattered, and the aircraft tumbled into the sea. The dogfight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Tom lost count of how many times he was shot at, how many times he thought he was about to die. His aircraft was taking a beating, holes puncturing the fuselage, one engine starting to overheat, but it kept flying, and so did he. When a third Zero locked onto him, Tom did something that no one expected. He flew straight at it, closing the distance in a deadly game of chicken. The Japanese pilot blinked first, breaking off, and Tom followed him through the turn, staying inside the Zero's radius and pouring fire into it. The enemy aircraft exploded in a ball of flame, and Tom pulled away, his hands shaking now from adrenaline and exhaustion. By the time the Japanese fighters disengaged and fled back toward their base, Tom had claimed 3 confirmed kills. The bomber formation had completed its mission, hitting the convoy and sending 2 transport ships to the bottom. As they flew back to Port Moresby, the radio chatter was full of disbelief. "Did anyone else see what Mitchell just did?" one pilot asked. "That crop duster just splashed 3 zeros," another confirmed. "I thought I was hallucinating." Tom said nothing, focusing on nursing his damaged aircraft home. Eddie was going to have his work cut out for him. When Tom landed, the entire base seemed to be waiting. As he climbed out of the cockpit, legs unsteady from the adrenaline crash, he found himself surrounded by pilots and ground crew, all of them staring at his shot-up aircraft in amazement. Eddie appeared, taking in the damage with a professional eye. "Captain, you trying to give me a heart attack? This thing looks like Swiss cheese." "Sorry, Eddie," Tom said with a tired smile. "She got me home, though." Lieutenant Brennan pushed through the crowd, his expression unreadable. He stopped in front of Tom, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Then Brennan extended his hand. "I owe you an apology, Mitchell," Brennan said, his voice stripped of its usual swagger. "What you did up there today, I've never seen anything like it. You flew that thing like a fighter, and you made it work." Tom shook his hand, seeing genuine respect in the younger pilot's eyes. "Just doing my job, Lieutenant." The next 3 days followed a similar pattern. The Japanese launched increasingly aggressive attacks, trying to regain air superiority over the region, and every time Tom found himself in the thick of it. His skill and unconventional tactics became legendary. He used the A-24's strengths, its ability to dive steeply and turn tightly at low speeds, to compensate for its lack of raw speed and power. On the second day, he shot down 4 more Zeros during a frantic battle over Oro Bay. One of the kills came after Tom deliberately stalled his aircraft in mid-air, dropping like a stone while a Zero overshot him. As the Japanese fighter passed overhead, Tom recovered from the stall and lit it up from below, a maneuver so audacious that the other pilots couldn't believe it had worked. On the 3rd day, Tom downed 2 more during an escort mission, bringing his total to 9. The number was staggering for any pilot, but for someone flying a dive bomber, it was unprecedented. Word spread through the Allied air forces in the Pacific, and reporters began showing up at the base, wanting to interview the pilot who had turned a maligned aircraft into a deadly weapon. But it was the 4th day that would cement Tom's place in history. Intelligence reported a major Japanese offensive being prepared, with a large formation of bombers and fighters heading toward Allied positions. Every available aircraft was scrambled to meet them, and Tom found himself flying alongside fighters, bombers, and everything else that could get airborne. The battle that ensued was the largest Tom had ever experienced. The sky was filled with aircraft, American and Japanese, all swirling in a massive furball that stretched for miles. Tom dove into the chaos, his focus narrowing to the immediate threats around him. He found himself engaged with multiple Zeros simultaneously, each one trying to get a firing solution on him. Tom flew like a man possessed, pushing the A-24 beyond anything its designers had ever imagined. He snap-rolled, he hammer-headed. He performed split-S maneuvers that should have torn the wings off his aircraft, but somehow didn't. During one desperate moment, Tom found himself sandwiched between two Zeros, both firing at him. He chopped his throttle and dropped his flaps, bleeding speed so rapidly that both Japanese fighters shot past him. As they did, Tom lit his afterburners, such as they were on the old bomber, and climbed after them, firing at both. One went down trailing smoke, and the other fled. The sky had become a three-dimensional maze of aircraft, tracer rounds, and smoke trails. Tom's situational awareness, honed over thousands of hours of instruction flying, kept him alive as he tracked multiple threats simultaneously. He had learned to fly by teaching nervous students, correcting their mistakes before they became fatal, and that heightened sense of anticipation served him well in combat. A Zero dove on him from above, the classic tactic, and Tom saw it coming 3 seconds before it opened fire. He pulled into a climbing spiral, using the dive bomber's surprisingly good low-speed handling to stay inside the Japanese fighter's turn radius. The Zero pilot, trained to fight other Zeros and fast American fighters, seemed confused by the bomber's behavior. Tom exploited that confusion ruthlessly. As the Zero tried to disengage and climb away, Tom followed, keeping his nose pointed at the enemy aircraft and firing in controlled bursts. His ammunition was running low. He could feel it in the way the guns rattled, and he needed to make every round count. The Zero's left wing root began to sparkle with impacts, and then suddenly the entire wing folded back, torn away by the combined stress of combat damage and high-G maneuvering. The Zero spun away, its pilot likely already dead or unconscious from the violent motion. Tom didn't watch it fall. He was already looking for the next threat. His radio crackled with urgent calls. One of the B-25 bombers was in trouble, hit by a Zero and trailing smoke, trying to make it back to base with 2 Japanese fighters harrying it like wolves after wounded prey. Tom vectored toward the bomber, pushing his damaged aircraft as hard as it would go. The B-25's tail gunner was firing desperately, but the Zeros were coordinating their attacks, one coming in high, while the other swept in low. Tom arrived just as the low Zero was lining up for a killing shot. He fired from extreme range, not expecting to hit but hoping to distract the enemy pilot. It worked better than he could have hoped. The Zero pilot, perhaps surprised to see a dive bomber acting as an escort fighter, broke off his attack and turned to face this new threat. Tom and the Zero closed on each other at a combined speed of over 400 miles per hour, both pilots firing, both committed to a deadly game of aerial chicken. Tom could see the Zero's muzzle flashes, could see the tracers reaching toward him like glowing fingers of death. Something slammed into his instrument panel, showering him with glass and sparks. He ignored it, keeping his finger on the trigger, walking his rounds into the Zero's engine cowling. At the last possible second, both pilots broke, rolling in opposite directions and passing canopy to canopy with less than 10 feet of separation. Tom caught a glimpse of the Japanese pilot's face, young and frightened, a mirror of every combat pilot who had ever faced death in the sky. The Zero's engine was smoking, leaking oil that streaked back along its fuselage. Tom could have pursued, could have finished it, but the second Zero was now attacking the B-25 again, and that took priority. He turned hard, feeling something in his airframe groan ominously, and positioned himself between the bomber and its attacker. The Japanese pilot must have decided that a damaged dive bomber wasn't worth the risk because he disengaged, climbing away toward the north. Tom watched him go, then formed up on the B-25's wing, escorting it home. The bomber's pilot gave him a thumbs up through his cockpit window, and Tom returned the gesture, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They had saved the bomber and its crew, and that mattered more than any personal tally of kills. But the battle wasn't over yet. As Tom and the B-25 headed for home, a fresh formation of Zeros appeared, drawn by the radio chatter about damaged American aircraft limping back to base. Tom counted 6 of them, all pristine and undamaged, all hungry for kills. The B-25 pilot's voice came over the radio, strained but determined. "Mitchell, get out of here. You've done enough. Save yourself." Tom's response was immediate and firm. "Negative. I'm with you all the way." What followed was 15 minutes of the most intense flying Tom had ever experienced. He positioned himself above and behind the bomber, using the B-25's defensive guns as part of his tactical equation. Every time a Zero attacked, Tom dove on it, forcing it to break off or face his guns. He was outnumbered 6-1. His aircraft was falling apart around him, and his ammunition was nearly exhausted, but he refused to abandon the bomber. The Zeros made multiple attack runs, probing for weaknesses, testing Tom's resolve. He met each one with aggressive counterattacks, convincing the Japanese pilots that he was more dangerous than he appeared. His reputation had preceded him, he realized. The enemy pilots had heard about the dive bomber Ace, and they were being cautious. That caution saved his life and the lives of the B-25's crew. Allied fighters finally arrived, drawn by the running battle, and the Zeros scattered. Tom watched them go, his hands trembling on the controls, his body soaked with sweat despite the cold air at altitude. The B-25 pilot's voice came over the radio again, this time thick with emotion. "Mitchell, I owe you a drink. Hell, I owe you a whole bar. You just saved 7 lives." "Just doing my job," Tom replied, though his voice was shakier than he would have liked. "Let's get home." As they approached Port Moresby, Tom realized just how badly his aircraft had been damaged. The control stick felt mushy, the rudder pedals barely responded, and the remaining engine was running rough. Eddie was going to need a miracle to repair this one. The tower cleared him for landing, but Tom could hear the tension in the controller's voice. His aircraft was visible from the ground, and it must have looked like a flying junkyard, barely holding together. Tom lined up on final approach, fighting the damaged controls every inch of the way. His airspeed was erratic, the engine was threatening to quit, and he had no hydraulic pressure for his brakes. This was going to be rough. He crossed the threshold at the edge of a stall, too slow but unable to go faster without losing control. The main gear touched down hard, bouncing back into the air, and Tom fought to keep the wings level. The second touchdown was even harder, and something in the landing gear collapsed with an audible crack. The A-24 skidded down the runway, throwing up sparks and dust, the wounded aircraft finally giving up its fight to stay airborne. Tom rode it out, applying what little brake pressure he had, steering with the rudder as best he could. The aircraft finally came to rest halfway down the runway, tilted awkwardly on its damaged landing gear, but it had brought him home one last time. Emergency crews were racing toward him before he even shut down the engine. Tom sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still on the controls, processing the fact that he was alive. His ears were ringing from the engine noise and gunfire, his body ached from the physical strain of combat flying, and his mind was exhausted from the sustained intensity of aerial combat. But he was alive, and the B-25 crew was alive, and that was what mattered. The battle raged for over an hour, and by the time it ended, Tom had scored 2 more confirmed kills during that 4th day alone, bringing his 4-day total to 11. His aircraft was barely recognizable, with so much damage that Eddie would later say it should have been written off as a loss the moment it landed. One engine was dead, the hydraulics were gone, the landing gear was destroyed, and there were holes in the fuselage large enough to put both fists through. The fact that it had flown at all was a testament to both American engineering and Eddie's meticulous maintenance. Tom landed more from skill and stubbornness than anything else, the A-24 groaning and protesting every second. As he shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit, the enormity of what he had done finally hit him. He had survived 4 days of intense combat, had achieved what many thought impossible, and had proven that determination and skill could overcome technological disadvantages. When he climbed out of the cockpit this time, the reception was different. There was no joking, no teasing. The other pilots looked at him with something approaching awe, and even the most hardened veterans nodded with respect. Brennan approached again, and this time his handshake came with genuine warmth. "Mitchell, I don't know how you did it, but you just became a legend. That crop duster comment, I'm never living that down, am I?" Tom smiled, bone-tired but content. "Probably not, Lieutenant, but I appreciate the sentiment." The commanding officer, Colonel Harris, appeared and pulled Tom aside. "Captain Mitchell, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross," the colonel said formally. "What you've accomplished is extraordinary. You've shown that it's not just the machine that matters, it's the pilot. And you, sir, are one hell of a pilot." "Thank you, sir," Tom replied, feeling humbled. "But I couldn't have done any of it without Eddie keeping my bird flying, or without the other pilots up there with me. This was a team effort." The colonel nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a true leader. We're going to need more men like you before this war is over." That evening, as the sun set over the Pacific and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Tom sat with Eddie beside the battered A-24. They were both quiet, processing everything that had happened over the past 4 days. The base had settled into its nightly routine, but there was a different energy in the air, a sense that something significant had occurred. Other pilots and crew members kept walking by, offering respectful nods or quiet words of congratulation. Tom noticed that even the ground crew, who had never spoken to him before, were treating him differently. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Part of him wanted to retreat, to escape the attention, and just be left alone with his thoughts. Eddie seemed to sense his discomfort. "You know, Captain, my grandfather used to tell me a story about samurai warriors. He said that the greatest samurai was not the one who sought glory, but the one who performed his duty with excellence and humility. I think he would have respected what you did up there." Tom looked at his crew chief, struck by the wisdom in those words. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," Eddie said quietly. "The government doesn't think so, of course. He's in Manzanar now, along with most of my family, just because of where their parents were born." The injustice of it hung in the air between them. Tom had always known about the internment camps intellectually, but hearing it from Eddie made it personal. Here was a man who had volunteered to serve his country, who had kept Tom's aircraft flying through impossible conditions, and his family was being imprisoned for no crime other than their heritage. "I'm sorry, Eddie," Tom said simply, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "It's not right." "No, it's not," Eddie agreed. "But that's why I'm here. Someone needs to prove that we're Americans too, that we can be trusted, that we're willing to die for this country. Maybe if enough of us serve, if enough of us prove ourselves, things will change." "They will," Tom said with conviction. "After this war, people will have to recognize what you and others like you have contributed. Your grandfather's wisdom, your skill, your loyalty, all of it matters. History will remember." Eddie smiled sadly. "I hope you're right, Captain. But even if history forgets, I'll know I did my part. And working with you these past months, keeping that bird flying, being part of your success up there, that means something to me. It means my contribution mattered." "It absolutely did," Tom assured him. "Every time I came back from a mission, every time that engine kept running when it should have quit, every time the controls responded when they were shot to hell, that was because of you. We're a team, Eddie. Those 11 kills belong to both of us." Eddie's eyes glistened with emotion, and he quickly looked away, pretending to examine a section of the aircraft's damaged wing. After a moment he spoke again, his voice carefully controlled. "They're going to retire her, you know." She's taken too much damage to be combat effective anymore. The structure is compromised in too many places. Even if we patched all the holes, she'd never pass inspection. Tom felt a pang of sadness. She earned her rest, he said. She did more than anyone ever expected. So did you, Captain, Eddie replied. My family back home, they're in those camps, being treated like enemies. But knowing that I helped keep you flying, that I was part of something that mattered, it makes it easier. Thank you for that. Tom looked at his crew chief, seeing the weight of complicated emotions in his face. Thank you, Eddie, for everything. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to emerge. The war was far from over, and there would be many more battles to come. But for this moment, Tom allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not pride in the killing, that part still troubled him deeply, but pride in having risen to meet a challenge, in having proven that courage and skill could triumph over dismissal and doubt. He had been mocked for flying a crop duster, but he had shown that in the hands of the right pilot, any aircraft could become formidable. The story of Captain Thomas Mitchell and his 11 victories in 4 days would spread throughout the military, becoming part of the lore of the Pacific War. It would be told in ready rooms and officers' clubs, embellished and mythologized over time. But the core truth remained simple. An underestimated pilot in an underestimated aircraft had achieved the extraordinary through skill, determination, and an unshakable commitment to his duty. Within days, reporters from Stars and Stripes and even some civilian newspapers arrived at the base, notebooks in hand, cameras ready. Tom hated the attention, but Colonel Harris insisted it was important for morale, both at home and among the troops. Reluctantly, Tom agreed to a few interviews, though he spent most of them deflecting credit to his fellow pilots and to Eddie. One reporter, a middle-aged woman from the New York Times named Margaret Chen, was more perceptive than the others. After the official interview, she pulled Tom aside and spoke to him quietly, away from the other journalists. Captain Mitchell, I've been covering this war for 2 years now, and I've interviewed dozens of pilots. Most of them love talking about their kills, their exploits. But you're different. Why is that? Tom considered the question carefully. Because every one of those 11 aircraft had a pilot in it, Mom, someone's son. Maybe someone's husband or father. I did what I had to do to protect my fellow airmen and to accomplish the mission. But I take no pleasure in the killing. If anything, I mourn for those men, even though they were the enemy. Margaret wrote furiously in her notebook, then looked up at him with respect in her eyes. That's the kind of honesty people need to hear, Captain. War isn't glorious. It's necessary sometimes, but it's never glorious. Thank you for being willing to say that. Her article, when it was published 2 weeks later, struck a chord with readers across America. She had captured not just Tom's achievements, but his humanity, his reluctance to celebrate death, even as he excelled at the grim necessities of war. The piece helped shift the narrative around combat pilots, emphasizing the weight they carried rather than just their victories. In the weeks that followed, Tom was transferred to a training command stateside, where his experience would be used to teach the next generation of pilots. The orders came through quickly, perhaps too quickly, and Tom suspected that the brass wanted to preserve him as a symbol rather than risk losing him in further combat. He had mixed feelings about that, guilt at leaving his squadron, but relief at the prospect of going home to Sarah. Before he left Papua New Guinea, Tom made a point of visiting every member of his squadron personally, shaking hands, offering encouragement. When he came to Lieutenant Brennan, the young pilot who had once mocked his crop duster, their conversation was longer. "Mitchell," Brennan said, his usual cockiness replaced with something deeper, more sincere, "I want you to know that you changed me. Not just as a pilot, but as a person. I judged you before I knew you. I saw your aircraft and your age, and I made assumptions. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for that. "We all make assumptions, Jake," Tom replied, using the lieutenant's first name for the first time. "The key is being willing to change them when we learn better. You're a good pilot, and you're going to be a good leader. Just remember that every person you meet has something to teach you if you're willing to learn." Brennan nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll remember, sir, and I'll make sure everyone knows what you did here. The real story, not just the kills, but who you were as a man." They shook hands one final time, and Tom could see in Brennan's eyes that the lesson had truly taken root. The young pilot would go on to have a distinguished career, would eventually make it home alive, and would spend the rest of his life honoring the example Tom had set. Eddie walked with Tom to the transport plane that would take him to the coast for his journey home. The crew chief was carrying Tom's duffel bag, despite Tom's protests that he could carry it himself. They walked in companionable silence for a while, both men dealing with the strange sadness of parting after having been through so much together. "Captain," Eddie said finally, stopping near the transport aircraft, "I want you to have something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal object, a piece of the A-24's fuselage that he had carefully shaped and polished. "It's from your bird. From the section right behind the cockpit. I thought you might want it as a reminder." Tom took the piece of metal, feeling its weight in his palm, seeing where Eddie had engraved the dates of the 4 days of combat and the number 11. His vision blurred with unexpected tears, and he had to clear his throat before he could speak. "Thank you, Eddie. I'll treasure this. And I want you to know something. When this war is over, when we've won and everyone can go home, you come find me in Montana. There will always be a place for you there. Whether you want to work with aircraft or just want somewhere to start fresh, you're family to me, and my door will always be open." Eddie's professional composure finally cracked, and tears ran down his face. "Thank you, Captain. That means more to me than you know." They embraced briefly, two men from vastly different backgrounds, bonded by shared experience and mutual respect. Then Tom climbed aboard the transport, and Eddie stepped back, saluting as the aircraft's engines roared to life. As the plane lifted off and Port Moresby fell away below, Tom looked out the window at the jungle, the airfield, the whole complex of war that had been his home for months. He thought about the men he was leaving behind, the ones who would continue fighting, and he prayed they would all make it home safely. The flight home took days, with multiple stops at various bases along the way. At each stop, word of Tom's presence would spread, and pilots would seek him out, asking for advice, wanting to hear his stories. He obliged as best he could, always emphasizing the fundamentals. Know your aircraft, fly it to its strengths, never give up, and look out for your wingman. At one base in Hawaii, a young pilot fresh from training approached him nervously. "Captain Mitchell, sir, I'm being sent to fly dive bombers, and everyone keeps telling me they're death traps. After what you did, I just wanted to ask, how do you not be afraid?" Tom looked at the young man, seeing his own younger self reflected there. "Son, anyone who tells you they're not afraid in combat is either lying or crazy. Fear is natural. The trick is not letting it control you. You acknowledge it, you use it to keep you sharp, but you don't let it paralyze you. And remember, it's not the aircraft that makes the difference. It's the pilot. Fly smart, fly aggressive, and take care of your crew. Do that and you'll be fine." The young pilot left looking more confident, and Tom hoped his words would help keep him alive in the battles to come. When Tom finally reached San Francisco and then made his way to Montana, Sarah was waiting for him at the train station. She had aged in the time he'd been gone, worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But her smile was the same brilliant expression he had fallen in love with years ago. They held each other for a long time on that platform, neither speaking, both just grateful that he had made it home. Later, as they drove through the familiar Montana landscape, Sarah reached over and took his hand. "I read the article in the Times," she said softly, "the one by Margaret Chen. It was beautiful, Tom. She captured who you really are." Tom squeezed her hand, watching the mountains rise in the distance. "I just did what needed to be done, Sarah. Nothing more." She smiled knowingly. "That's exactly what makes you extraordinary, Tom. You don't even realize it." He would never fly combat again, but his impact on the war effort would continue through those he trained and inspired. Many of them would go on to become aces themselves, and they would always credit Captain Mitchell with teaching them that success in combat was about more than just having the best equipment. It was about heart, skill, and the willingness to use whatever tools you had to their maximum potential. Lieutenant Brennan, humbled by Tom's example, would become a better pilot and a better leader. He would survive the war and return home to Boston, where he would tell his children and grandchildren about the man who flew a crop duster and became a hero. Eddie Nakamura would continue to serve as a crew chief throughout the war, his skill and dedication never wavering despite the injustice faced by his family. After the war, he would return to California and become a successful aircraft mechanic, eventually opening his own shop. He would remain friends with Tom for the rest of his life, and they would correspond regularly, sharing memories and maintaining the bond forged in those desperate days in the Pacific. The A-24 Banshee that Tom flew would eventually be sent back to the United States, where it would be repaired and displayed in a museum as a testament to what could be achieved with courage and determination. Visitors would read the placard detailing Tom's achievements and marvel that such an unassuming aircraft had played host to such extraordinary feats. Tom himself would rarely talk about his 4 days of glory. When asked about it, he would deflect, saying that he was simply doing what needed to be done, that any pilot would have done the same. Those who knew him understood that his humility was genuine, that he truly did not see himself as exceptional. But he was exceptional in ways that transcended aerial victories and combat medals. He was exceptional because he represented the best of what people could be. Determined in the face of adversity, skilled through dedication and hard work, and humble despite achievement. He had been mocked and dismissed, but he had never let that define him. Instead, he had let his actions speak, and they had spoken volumes. As the war ground on toward its eventual conclusion, Tom would think often about those 4 days over Papua New Guinea. He would remember the fear, the adrenaline, the impossible odds. But more than anything, he would remember the lesson he had proven. That it's not the machine that makes the difference, it's the person operating it. Give a skilled, determined person even limited tools, and they can achieve remarkable things. The young pilots he trained would absorb this lesson, carrying it with them into combat and beyond. They would face their own challenges, their own moments when they were underestimated or dismissed. And they would remember Captain Mitchell and his crop duster. They would remember that courage and skill could overcome any disadvantage, that determination could turn mockery into respect. Years after the war ended, Tom would return to Montana and resume his life as a flight instructor. He would teach farmers and ranchers to fly their small planes, just as he had before the war, finding satisfaction in the simple act of helping others achieve their dreams of flight. He would watch the sun rise over the vast Montana landscape and think about how far he had traveled, both physically and metaphorically, and he would feel grateful for having survived to see it. On quiet evenings, sitting on his porch with Sarah beside him, Tom would sometimes look up at the sky and remember the weight of the stick in his hands, the sound of the engine straining, the sight of an enemy aircraft in his gun sights. The memories had lost some of their sharp edges with time, but they remained vivid enough to remind him of who he had been and what he had accomplished. He had been an ordinary man, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and he had risen to meet them. He had been mocked for his crop duster plane, but in the end, he had shot down 11 Japanese Zeros in 4 days, a feat that would be remembered and respected long after the mockery had been forgotten. That was the real victory, not the aerial kills themselves, but the proof that ordinary people, given the opportunity and the determination, could achieve the extraordinary. It was a lesson that transcended war, that applied to every aspect of life. And it was a lesson that Tom Mitchell had taught through his actions more effectively than any words could convey. The crop duster had become a legend, and so had the man who flew it. But Tom would always insist that he was just a pilot doing his job, nothing more and nothing less. That humility, that refusal to be defined by glory, was perhaps his greatest achievement of all. As night fell over Montana and the stars emerged one by one, Tom would close his eyes and feel the peace that came from knowing he had done his duty, had proven his worth, and had come home to the life he loved. The war had tested him in ways he could never have imagined, but it had not broken him. Instead, it had revealed the strength that had been there all along, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. And when that moment came, Tom Mitchell had been ready. He had flown his crop duster into history, and he had shown the world that it's not what you fly that matters, it's how you fly it. That lesson, learned in the skies over Papua New Guinea in 1943, would echo through the decades, inspiring generations of pilots and reminding everyone that with skill, determination and courage, anything is possible. The mockery had turned to respect. The crop duster had become a weapon, and an ordinary man had become extraordinary. That was the true story of Captain Thomas Mitchell, and it was a story worth remembering.